We are joined today by Andrea. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing your name right. I'm sorry. Is that the right way to say it?
Don't worry. Andrea, I honestly don't care.
Okay. Well, welcome.
As long as it resembles my name, I'm golden.
I have several friends like that. They're like, you can just call me this letter because no one can pronounce my name. Oh, is it having problems again, Bunny? Or is that in reference to, oh, whoever, like, I'll answer to whatever? I just see, oh. Gives me pause. We've had a rocky start,
Ah,
so. um,
like do we look like Martians?
we probably are a little grainy, I'm not gonna lie. But hopefully things are good. Okay, well, I am gonna ask you to just introduce yourself really quick, I guess, and make sure everything's good because I'm not seeing a reply saying like the oh was nothing's working. So we're gonna assume everything's good still and have you introduce yourself.
Fair enough. Well, hello everyone. My name is Andrea Septién. I am an author. Right now, YA. I just published a book called Sunlit Ruins, and I like writing. I like cats, and I currently live in Australia.
That is a great list of things. I
So
love
those are
it.
some cute facts. Oh, Mexican American. That is relevant because of what the book's about. I'm also that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking time to be here with us, and thank you for introducing yourself. um, Going off of that, my first question is actually I love that you contrasted the two sides of the family in this story living on the two sides of the America Mexico border or the US Mexico border. But why did you choose to set the story for two Mexican American girls in Mexico instead of the United States?
Okay, so for that one specifically, because I knew I wanted to talk about the contrast between, growing up in the United States versus growing up in Mexico. And the thing is, growing up, so I was born and raised in Mexico City. And usually the media that I would see, especially involving any kind of like Mexican or Mexican American, they would almost always take place in the USA.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things that that's just always what I saw, and I was like, if they did go to Mexico, it was either like for something super quick, or it was like always with a sepia filter. So at that point in time, when I wrote this, I knew I wanted it to take place actually in Mexico, because at that point in time, I was just like, that's kind of what I wanted as I was growing up,
Yeah.
and also because it's the city I know. I've never lived in the United States. I visited, but I've never lived there.
Yeah.
So it just made it so much easier to set it in a city that I actually know.
That makes sense. I think that really comes out too in the writing because, like, you feel like you're there and you're experiencing this, like, thriving city all around you as, like, the backdrop of the story. There's some details you go into about, like, alleyways and stuff like that. And I was just like, oh, I feel like I can really picture it in my head. And if you lived there and it's your lived experience, that makes it make sense, right?
Thank you very much.
My next question for you, I'm going to butcher this word and I am so sorry. I listened to the
Don't worry.
audiobook, so I should be able to pronounce it, but I'm sure I will mess it up. Is why did you use the pantheon of Teotihuacan instead of a more well-known pantheon like the Aztecs or things that like you would have seen growing up in school here, like Voyage of the Mimi or whatever? It was like all Mayan hieroglyphics
Mm.
and stuff. Anyway, why did you choose that particular pantheon?
Well, kind of like in the similar thing, because I always saw, the Aztec pantheon, the Mayan pantheon, and it's like you learn about those also because back home there's still a lot of indigenous groups who do kind of follow like are like they're Mayan, they're proudly Mayan, or people who follow they're not Aztec, but they're groups that are kind of like semi-descended from them.
Mhm.
So they do all that stuff. So I learned about that growing up. But there was also these pyramids that were just to the north. And when I was a kid, we visited them, and I was like, whoa, this was back when you could still climb the pyramids.
Oh, wow.
Like I went all the way to the top. I saw everything out there. And then when I was figuring out the story, it was just like, oh, well, like I've already heard a lot of just, the more well-known stuff. And it was just like, but I don't consider myself an expert on Aztec and Mayan, like that philosophy, that pantheon, that sort of stuff. So it's like, if I did go about it, I would, I'd have to, I'm not an expert at it. And I was just like, well, if I'm not an expert in it anyway, why don't I just broaden my scope and see if I can find something else to learn in? Because I'd have to learn a bunch of stuff anyway. So then I was just like, wait a minute, what about those pyramids? And then the more I dug into it, the more I realized just exactly how much history they have.
Yeah.
I was like, when you're a kid and you get taken around places, and it's like, this is important, and you're like, yeah, sure. And then when you're older, you're like, oh no, that place was actually really important.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Definitely.
So it's like, if I'm not an expert in any of this anyway, even the more well-known stuff, I might as well just like see if I can find something else, like even just to distinguish the story from other stuff, because everyone knows the Aztecs, and like maybe interested in that, but it's already been done. And here's like, oh, here's something different. Here's something not a lot of people know about. And since I'm a beginner anyway, I can just go into it with fresh eyes, and then actually really figure out what happened here.
That's great. And I love the way in the book that you kind of tie it in with the stuff that came after, right? Like you really show a little bit of a connection between or at least I felt like there was a connection there between like this pantheon you've probably never heard of and how it influenced the pantheons that people are more familiar with. So I thought that was really great too.
That's the super interesting bit is like the connections that you didn't realize were there.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's just like it's weird but also fascinating.
Yeah. It's always cool to learn about another like mythological, folklore, religious background too, right? Like I had a great time reading the book and learning about these gods that I honestly had never heard of most of them before. So I think I had heard of one. So
Well, if you learned something, that's all I can ask.
I don't want to give away any scenes, but there's a certain god that's going through an identity crisis and they're trying on a bunch of clothes and stuff, and I loved that scene. I thought it was so amazing.
You get along with my friend who was one of the beta readers for them, and they absolutely adored that character you're talking about.
They're fantastic.
It was a lot of fun writing them, I'm gonna be honest.
It showed. Another thing I noticed while reading is you didn't have like a really distinguishable romance going on in the book. Like it felt like it was a lot more about the relationship between the cousins, and especially the two female cousins, and like how they had grown apart and are trying to come back together because they're thrown into this ridiculous situation. But there wasn't like somebody that I'd point to and be like, oh, that's Miri's love interest, or that's Ada's love interest. Was that on purpose? And if so, why did you want to do that?
So it was actually very much on purpose. Because, again, tying into me growing up, you read YA, you see all the movies, you see all the TV shows, and every single teenage main character has a love interest. Mm-hmm. There's always a relationship. And I went through all of my teenage years having no relationships, no romance. There was nothing.
Yeah.
There were crushes. There was a couple of kisses, and that's it. I had no romance in my teenage years when I had come to expect it.
Yeah.
So, really, every single book I read, it seemed like there was some romance, especially always with the main character. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, I was just like, well, this isn't actually representative. of when we, and also a lot of friends went through. I have a lot of friends who never went into a relationship
Yeah.
when we were teenagers. So I didn't. So when I finally got the chance to write a book, I'm like, I'm not writing a relationship in this. A little out of spite, just a little bit. And then afterwards, it just made sense not to add it because it would have detracted away from the family conflict.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't want to do that, especially because in the end, it would make no sense of just like, here's a random love interest. And it's like, why are you here?
Oh, by the way, we slapped one on.
Yeah. So that's why, like, I very specifically with the leads, I was just like, you are getting no love interest. You're, I'm sorry, but you're gonna be like me for this. You're getting no love interest for the foreseeable future.
I think there's something great about that, right? Because there's so many female protagonists in like YA fantasy. It's a little bit harder to find female protagonists, but like they are starting to be more prevalent. But you're right, they are always attached to some guy by the end of the book, and it does create this expectation of like, oh, if I'm not doing that, is there something wrong with me? Or like if I don't want that, is there something wrong with me? And so I love that you have these two girls that are just like fully becoming themselves, and that doesn't necessarily include a guy that's not related to them. So I also really love their older male cousin in the book. He's such a great like presence and like role model for them, and I love the ways that he's almost like a father figure at times, but then at other times he's like their little brother. So you still get fun dudes in the book too, but I like that it didn't have romance.
We have a mix. There is a mix in there.
Yes. Danielle is also a very cool character. So let's see here. Which character do you relate to more personally, Miri or Ada? And is it different now than it was when you were 15?
Ooh, okay. All right. What?
I know my answer, so.
All right. So now, so now I would say probably a bit more Ada, but that's just because I'm generally much more girly. I'm much less sarcastic than I was when I was a teenager, though that does still come out. I do swear more, but that's just because I'm living in Australia and that's just how things roll here.
Yeah.
But in terms of just like general energy and personality and clothes, Ada. But I do still relate to Miri in the sense of just like past experiences and like how that affects me. Because like background wise, I've always been more Miri, like because I was raised in Mexico.
Yeah.
So that's the background I relate to more by default. When I was a teenager, it would have been much more split because I was a lot more sarcastic.
Yeah.
There were just teenage hormones. They make you go through stuff. Just kind of all that sort of just it was much. I would say it was a little bit more split back then.
Yeah.
But personality-wise, more Ada. Background, always Miri. So I tried to split it as much as I could, but then it was also like I know that if you talk to me, I sound more bubbly. I'm also an introvert. So but yeah, probably Ada. Damn it.
I was wondering if that would be your answer because I was noticing the podcast you used to do, like everything was really pink and like purples and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, I wonder if this is like younger her and older her in the same book.
Yeah, pretty much. So it's like now I'm much more like I've always just been pinky and girly and all of that sort of stuff. Now it's a little bit more mellow, but at the same time it's like long live pink and purple.
Yes, I agree. As you can tell from my Twitch channel, all of my branding is like different variations on pink. But yeah. Great. Thank you for answering that. Sorry, this isn't on anything that I sent you ahead of time, but I am curious. Like, obviously, there is some pretty intense stuff that Miri's dealing with in the book. Is that something that you know someone who's experienced or maybe experienced yourself? Like, where did you write that from? I guess is my question. And sorry
Yeah.
if it's not an okay topic,
Oh, no
you
worries.
don't have to answer.
Happy to talk. So for context, Mary kind of went through something when she was younger, related just to like general public safety for young girls back home.
Yeah.
And there was just this guy who kind of just followed her, and luckily everything settled. There wasn't anything too bad, but it is something that you can't really escape if you're a woman back home, especially a young woman,
Okay.
because unfortunately in Mexico we do have very high rates of femicides,
Yeah.
like being killed or targeted specifically because you're a woman. Decent amounts of just, you hear stories all the time. So when I was young, I was actually flat out banned from using public transportation because there were
Wow.
so many security concerns
Yeah.
of just me doing that stuff. So it's like my brother, he can, do all sort of do, use whatever he wants, no fear at all. But he's a guy, and unfortunately, we are at the thing where it's just, it makes you more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I've known people who have been through similar experiences. It's one of those things that you just hear about a lot, and it's something that just you're kind of very much aware of
Okay.
when you grow up in that environment. So it's one of those things of, it's not like, I don't want it to sound like, okay, Mexico's completely unsafe, because it's not.
Yeah.
Like, that gets very overblown.
100%.
But,
Yes.
but at the same time, you can't deny reality of these actual cases where just it's not always the safest for women back home, and that is something that is a very big topic of contention and something that people are angry about.
Yeah. And I would also just like put in it's not a strictly Mexico problem. And I just want to be real clear on that. When I was reading it, it very much uh, it felt similar to things I've experienced living in New York City, and it felt similar to things that other people have talked about, like in Japan and other countries. So it's not like, obviously, the levels of femicide and stuff like that that is happening in Mexico is a problem and definitely needs addressed. And I don't want to say it's like the same as everywhere else, right? But also, this is not a uniquely Mexico thing, and it was not me trying to say, like, oh,
Oh, no worries.
or
No,
ask a question that implies that. So, just to be really clear to anybody watching this later, uh, that's not what this is about. Anyway, just felt like it needed clarification because it, yeah. Anyway,
it's the internet.
yes. And I don't know who my followers are or will be in the future. So, real clear
Fair enough.
right from the start, it's not because it's Mexico. Anyway, this book has some pretty intense twists in it. I want to keep that kind of vague, but I'm mainly thinking of a large one at the end that kind of ties the themes of family and sacrifice together really beautifully and intensely, and left me on a cliffhanger for book two. Do you want to talk about any of the decisions you made that will kind of keep readers guessing as they're going through the book?
Ooh, okay, yeah. But first off, sorry about that. Gotta get the hype for book two.
Ah, it was so good, and
But
it's such a good ending. Anyway, I wasn't mad.
I'm happy to hear. Uh, well, okay, so basically, I would say like the thing that keeps you guessing is just how exactly is the family involved, and how deep does it go?
Yeah.
Because that's something that gets slowly like pieced together, and it's gonna get even crazier in book two. I can say that.
Yay.
I just, because I would just say like there's history behind specifically the family and just how they've gone through stuff.
Okay.
And then at the end, because again, this book I wanted it to be about family and culture shock, but also just like, how you can bridge that divide by actually, interacting with family.
Yeah.
And then it comes to the point, well, are you willing to sacrifice something to either keep it together, protect it, or just, get through with it? And then figuring out how deep does that go. I would say that is one of the twists that you get into in book one, and then later on in book two. I can't say that.
That's amazing, and that's a lot. Thank you. um, we are about the halfway mark, so I have one more question I'm going to ask you, and then if anybody in the chat has a question, feel free to type it in and I will ask her because I'm fairly certain she is not able to see my Twitch chat because it's not hooked up through anything that we're doing. So I'll ask her, but type away in the comments if you have any questions for her. I know you have said you pull from your own experiences growing up in Mexico City. How much and how, I guess, did that inspire or affect how you wrote this story? Aside from like obvious things like, oh, it's, we're in this location, or the thing about the bus safety, right? Like that is a uniquely you story, but yeah.
Well, part of it is just like, just because I've interacted with, Mexican Americans from the U.S. and then just talking to them and seeing just like seeing some of the culture clashes of just like how they view certain things, or just like, because back home it's one of those things of like, if a friend invites you to go out for something like that, but you say like, oh, I can't, I'm going to my grandma's birth, I'm seeing my grandma or something like that. That's an automatic excuse to get you out of any social situation. Whereas like I've seen like in the US it's like, it's like maybe what, just like something else or whatever, that's more like a friend-centered culture compared to a family-centered culture. So, like,
Yeah.
I've seen that when interacting with people like sometimes in the US, also in Australia here, well, I've been here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was just like, okay, this is kind of like what I grew up with. It was always just like, it's like it's not like, oh, Mexicans love their family more than Americans. Like that's not it. But it's just different stuff that gets emphasized in day-to-day life, I suppose.
Yeah.
Or like just gets focused on a little bit more. Like you see a lot more family dramas here, like in terms of just like, TV productions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I guess that's why I focused that on that theme of it.
Yeah.
Another thing was just a lot of the locations that I picked that they go to in the book. It's either locations that I have a personal attachment to, or locations that I just think are just cool to show. Or it's like if someone came to my city, I would just want to show it to them.
I would love to see like a bus tour of all the stuff in the Sunlit Ruins. It would be great.
Here is the plaza. Here is the angel. Here is the embassy, which kind of looks like a defense fort. So, kind of like things like that. And again, just very much Mary's background of just, people here are smiley, cheery, happy, and I just wanted to contrast that with someone who just did not quite fit in that culture, if that made sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Because but you do have like people like sarcastic, just like not people, not people back home.
Yeah.
But it's generally not what you expect when you talk to just your average Mexican. Because in general we're fairly loud, we're fairly social. So I wanted to try to make as much contrast as possible based on Mexico as I know it. But at the same time, I do have to acknowledge that I know the city from a place where, like Mary, come from a decently well-off family.
Yeah.
Which means I actually have the fortune to, not have to put myself in more dangerous situations. I have an American passport. That's a big one. I don't have to worry about visas if I want to visit the U.S.
Yeah.
But I do have to acknowledge that I do come from this place from a point where, I can enjoy the city more. Because I do, I come from a decent background.
Yeah.
So I do have to acknowledge that. like I come from a point where I can speak English. I went to a school that, you know, allowed me to learn it and write it. And, you know, not everyone gets that. So I do have to acknowledge
Which is great. Like I guess I take for granted sometimes how like some of my places of privilege, right? I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so as I was reading it, that wasn't necessarily something that jumped out at me, but you pointing it out as like, oh yeah, like I know there was a little section in there where you talked about like, oh, um, not everyone can afford to not take the bus, you know, and some stuff like that. So it's definitely like in there. And if I were thinking more critically, maybe I would have noticed it. But I appreciate you pointing that out and like saying that because it is a lot of really cool locations and a lot of like driving around to vastly far away places. Not too big of a spoiler, I don't think, but there is like an entire like magical fight that happens on a highway between
that.
like three cars. So
Yeah, I wrote that in because I wanted a car chase scene.
it
Like,
was
I wanted
so
a car
good.
chase scene. I'm so happy to hear that.
uh, I'm glad that you wanted a car chase scene. Was there a specific reason you wanted it? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm gonna be honest, I thought it was just fun.
Yeah, I mean, why not? The Michael Bay version of writing, but like, it was interesting and I followed it, and there weren't a lot of womp womps in the background. We have.
I was just like, I want a car chase scene. How do I fit this in?
I will make it happen. Well, it was excellently executed. We have one question in the chat right now. Have you ever heard of National Novel Writing Month? Or Nano?
I'm doing it right now.
Okay, that was the question is, are you participating? And do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
Okay, so I am participating. Um, I'm I'm working on a separate project for it, but as soon as I like proper finish my outline for book 2, I'm also going to be working on that this month.
Oh no.
Because
that's a lot. But go you.
look, at this point in time, it's just like, may as well. And advice for aspiring authors, like the thing is, okay, so the thing is that it really is true of that you can think of all the ideas of whatever you want, but eventually you do have to write it. But what I would say to them is just things get so much easier when you have something.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you have to like start exercising and that first day at the gym just sucks. But then afterwards it makes the process easier. Because even if you write something, and even if it's terrible, because it will be terrible, it's easier to work off of that than working off of something else. So even if it's just like 200 words, 300 words, it's something that you can go back on and be like, hey, it was something, and it was 300 words more than yesterday.
Yes.
And if you keep that up for 10 days, suddenly you have 3K words.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you can do a little, and it feels like it's way too little, it's always more than if, you know, you couldn't. And if you can't, you know, that's fine, okay. You know, people, sometimes it's just not in the cards for the day. But if you can't do it, even just the tiniest bit, it does add up. And it's always easier to work off of something that's partially built than starting flat out from scratch.
Yeah. Definitely. And you're getting woos and 100% in the chat. It's like, yeah. And we got another question. This person's saying, I understand that your story is more focused on the relationship of family and friends rather than romance. My question is, how do you make your characters more interesting for the audience through character development and all without them having a romantic interest?
Okay. Yeah. So what I would say to that is, because I would say in a lot of like romances, there's the tension of like, ooh, will they get together? Won't they? How do they feel about each other? You know, not that they're in a relationship, but now. But tensions exist in all kinds of relationships. Like you can have tensions between friends, tensions between family members. So I would say that kind of, it's I would say character development, it comes from points of tension, of like points where, this person either needs to change or wants to change, or, how do they get through this point in the story and develop to the point where they can get through in the story. And you can develop that through either, like the situation, with the world, like, oh, I need to adapt by doing whatever thing, or I have to push myself to get on a bus when I don't wanna, or, oh, I actually have to work on this relationship with my cousin and try not to fight with her. Because points of tension, they don't just exist in romance, they exist with all kinds of relationships. Yeah. So it's like, this person doesn't understand me, I don't understand them, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So you don't need romance to build tension, because tension exists in so many other places as well. And it's just finding that and digging your finger into it. And then just pushing them and pushing them. Basically, the more your characters suffer, the more interesting it is. You have to suffer in multiple ways.
Nice. So just putting stress tests on them. Lots and lots of stress tests.
Because, like, in everyday life, we have stressors, and they're not necessarily connected to romance.
100%. And family is a great one.
And if you're in a healthy relationship, the stressor usually isn't the romance. The stressor is usually something else.
Yeah.
It's just about finding stressors, which don't necessarily have to be romantic.
That is a great answer, and I like it. Does anybody... He has been fantastic through this process, and thank you to him for hooking us up and reaching out, because I'm super excited to have you on here. They say thank you so much. I think you helped clarify what they were trying to get around in their head with characters that they are writing. So thank you. Let's see here. I have some other questions that I've written if nobody else has one in the chat, because I'm not seeing any pop up right now. So I'll move to one of mine, and then we can always move back to chat. If somebody thinks of something, feel free to knock it on out. Yep. Let's see here. What would you like your readers to know about you as an author, and the stories that you like to tell, or even the stories that you like to read, right? Like, I think there's crossover there sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, so I generally tend towards fantasy. So either be contemporary fantasy, high fantasy, just anything with magic, I'm on board. But I also just like quote unquote cozier novels. So it's like Legends and Lattes, which is cozy fantasy.
It's so good.
Love it so much. It's like, I'm now in what my friend likes to call Japanese novels with a cat on the cover phase. So it's like, before the coffee gets cold, it's like what you're looking for is in the library. That's the one I'm reading right now, and it's so good. And it's just like, it's just like, calmer, sweet, like some, like, just, it's just a vibe.
Yes.
But I also like high fantasy emotional stakes, as that's kind of what I like to write. And I also just know that I love cats, because eventually I do want to write. I like just anything with cats I adore. So books with cats on the cover, I'm on that. And as for what I like to write, right now it's a lot of family dynamics.
Yeah.
A lot of identity stuff, because I went through my own miniature identity crisis several years ago.
Yeah.
A decent amount of Mexican stuff, because, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Although I do do some like slow burn stuff so far that has not been officially published, but I'm working on it, because I just generally really love slow burns.
Yeah.
When I go to AO3, that is one of my top tags.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing. You're getting hearts and lols about the cats on the cover.
It's a weakness, okay?
It's a weakness that I believe we share, and also my mother also shares it because she has an entire cozy mystery series that's all like cat puns.
Oh,
Cat on the cover, usually on some kind of coffee table, and then a cat pun. Or she also has one that's a baking pun set of cozy mysteries, but they still have
oh,
cats. So you're not
I
alone.
agree. I agree.
We're a cat obsessed community here as well because my logo, I don't know if you noticed it or not, it has a cat face in it. Love
Oh, I
cats.
love
Have two of
this.
them. All right, let's see here. You've already kind of answered my next question, which was, do you have any more novels beyond the Archives of the Forgotten planned? And it sounds like yes, several.
Uh, so far, like right now, I'm developing one of just this one's more contemporary. Like it's technically a contemporary romance, which actually takes place in Australia and is related to my kind of related to my relationship with my husband, and also just the struggle of getting a postgraduate visa in Australia.
Oh yeah, I could see that being a lot.
So yeah, so basically that, but imagine it more lighthearted.
That sounds fun.
So far it's intriguing, but just it's getting past that initial draft of just like just finish it that is getting to me a bit. So that's one of the things I'm trying to work on.
Yeah. Have you found there is a little bit of like whiplash there going from a story that purposefully had no romance to writing a romance?
A bit, yeah. Because and the other one is like, there's no romantic tension. I don't have to worry about how do I do like subconscious flirting to what I'm doing there because they don't. It's one of those idiots in love tropes of like they don't really realize it. There's a bit of whiplash there, but it also helps you differentiate the two books very clearly.
Gotcha.
So it's kind of like sometimes when I'm reading two books at a time, I'll read one in Spanish and one in English. So it's a bit of a whiplash going from book to book, but I also very clearly know how to distinguish the book that I'm reading.
Because this one, if you picture it on the page, it looked different
Right.
than this one.
So
Yeah.
in some ways, the whiplash helps. It like yanks me
Yeah.
out of it.
Well, and like you set the mood with your writing space and your mindset, and you just dive in, and you've got very distinct, separate worlds you're building. So that makes sense.
Pretty much, yeah. Like
Oh.
in a way, it helps, but it's also just like I need to remember how to write flirty dialogue.
It's the worst. I'm trying to write a cozy mystery for Nano, and there's a love interest in it, and I'm just like, I'm bad at flirting with my husband. I don't know how to write this. Anyway.
If you're married, I'm married. At this point in time, we don't have to flirt.
I mean, he likes it when I do. I'm just so bad at it. I've always been bad at it. He's really good at it, but I didn't
Maybe
get
I
the
should just
romance gene.
accumulate those bits. Just like here, computer, make them flirt.
Right? I wrote what I want the end goal to be. You give them dialogue. We did get another question, and it's, do you like to put cats in your stories like the cat in Sailor Moon? A cat that kind of helps the protagonist? Or is that something you would be interested in doing in the future? Because I know it wasn't in this series, right? But
Yeah.
yeah.
Like it wasn't in this series because there was no way I could logically fit it in. But if I can, I will. Because so I also wrote like a short story which is free by the way if you want to read it.
Yes. I have the link in the chat. I'm sorry I forgot to mention that earlier. There's two links in the chat. One is to the Bandel Books page that has her book available, and then I also put a download link for the short story that's a prequel to the book. So sorry about that.
So such short story, free prequel. So I actually dedicated that to my cat.
Oh, I love it.
So if you go to the dedication page, it has all the names of my cats. that I've had over the course of my lifetime.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
Tao, Calico, Maximiliano, Leonardo, Tomas, and Princess Amelia Mignonette Thermopolis Rinaldi II.
Oh my gosh. It's amazing. I love the Princess Diaries reference.
Also known as Princess Mia. Yeah.
It's amazing.
So Princess Mia, the full title in the dedication page.
As she should. You're getting awes and hearts. I'm doing this with, they have a dog named Peanut Butter. They call them PB for short, and they say, I'm doing this with PB. You have inspired. Let's see.
Look, this is the benefit of actually writing your own stuff. It's kind of like when you're an adult and you can be like, I can do whatever I want now. It's like, I can dedicate this to my cats and no one can stop me.
Try to.
Yeah. Maybe the publisher, but here's the benefit of being being part of like indie publishing. You get more freedom to do whatever you want. And what's he gonna do? Tell me no?
And if he does, are you gonna have to listen? They say it sounds like the name of royalty. It is. It's from a book and movie called The Princess Diaries that starred Anne Hathaway and Julie Andrews in the movie. But yeah, it's an amazing name. Perfection.
Specifically, Princess Diaries 2 was my jam when I was a kid.
Is that the one with the mattress slide?
Yes, that's the one.
Every time I see the trailer, I'm like, I love Julie Andrews so much.
Julie Andrews, Anne Hathaway, Chris Pine. What more do you want?
Like baby Chris Pine too, like Chris Pine before he was Chris Pine.
I know.
So yeah.
And it's beautiful. Mia got named after her, and now my mother knows her name by heart.
Excellent, excellent.
Her by the full title.
You must refer to her. All of the names.
So she is my little princess. And now I was just like, I can't not dedicate a book to her. She was like, she's, my companion.
I heard some other recognizable names in there. Is she the only one that's named after like a fictional character or a person, or is it just coincidence that the other ones had some names that sound familiar?
Okay, let's go through all the cats.
Okay.
Okay, so first cat that I had was when I was like super young. Like my parents had him before I was even born. His name is Tao, T-A-O.
Okay.
And apparently, my father named him after some lion he watched in a documentary. Yeah, something like that, because he was an orange cat, and then he got huge.
He's living up to his name. That's fine.
Exactly. Then when I was a kid, we got a cat named Calico. She was a calico cat, so that was very original naming. So a Calico, and she was one of those cats who just like hated everyone except like one person.
Oh.
My father specifically, but we loved her anyway. She was great. We also had Maximilian, who got named because that's the name my brother chose, and he just always loved the name Max.
Oh, yeah.
Then we have Leonardo, who was partially named after Leonardo da Vinci, partially named after the Ninja Turtle.
That's what I was going to ask. But then I was like, is that weird?
It's adorable.
It is. And I was like, I know that name.
Leo. And we also have Tomas, so Tommy, and he's, Tomas is a name that the families like always love, but it's also in my head also named after Thomas Wraith from the Dresden Files.
Yes.
Also because he's black and white.
I love that they're getting more fictional as they go.
Look, Tomas was a universally agreed upon name, but I have been pushing the name Tomas for years because I love it, and also because I love the character from the Dresden Files.
It makes sense.
Then you have Mia, who, as you can tell, I named her when I was 11.
See, I have named mine after comic book characters, and that was when I was like 31, so I have no excuses.
What are
But
your cats named? I
we have
must know.
Diana and Diana is named after Wonder Woman, and Helena is named after Huntress.
Oh,
So
nice.
they're my baby girls. They're black cats. I love them. Two
Ooh.
little panthers. Anyway, but yeah, big fan of cats on this channel. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by my special interest in cats. Uh, do you have any advice for writers that are kind of starting out on their journey? I know you already talked about like work that writer muscle, right? But is there anything that you have found helpful over your practice?
Write what you want to read.
It's good
Like
advice.
everyone says, like, oh, look at the tropes, look at the market. But at the end of the day, you're only going to have the actual motivation to write if you write what you actually want to read.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, especially if you want to get published or publish yourself, you will have to reread this multiple times to the point where you're sick of it. It will be much easier if you write what you read. Or if you just want to write for yourself, you may as well just write what you want to read. Like, you're doing this mostly for you.
Yeah.
So, write what you want to read. And if you really want to take that extra step, write what you wish you were able to read when you needed it. Like, this is the kind of story I would have wanted to, like, read when I was whatever, in whatever stage of life.
Yeah.
Because that lights a fire under your butt.
So, the book that we're talking about today, is that what you wanted to read when you were 15, or were you maybe a little bit younger and like wanted these girls to look up to? Like, what were you envisioning as you were writing it?
I think, yeah, roughly like 15, maybe a bit younger, but of just, the because back home, frankly, there aren't a lot of Mexican Americans actually in Mexico.
Yeah.
It's like everything I had, it was always just like, oh, so in the US, in the US. I've never lived in the US. There were some things I just didn't get.
Yeah.
And it's like I wanted, so part of it was like, yeah, writing that for me. Like, this is, what I want, what I would have really enjoyed reading when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And other parts was just, even now, it's like, rarely do I see a lot of these stories like actually set in Mexico.
Yeah.
Or if they do, they're just, they're smaller, they're smaller stuff and usually written by people back home.
Yeah.
And, a lot of that doesn't get translated into English because, smaller market, smaller niche.
Yeah.
And at this point, I was just like, if I had to write it, I want to do something that, I would have enjoyed. Like, even with the Teotihuacan and the pyramids, it's like I could have been like, I've been there. So part of it, yeah, it was that. So that made it much more like it made me want to keep writing it,
Yeah.
even when I was struggling just to finish the first draft. And it made me want to stick with the story by the time I was on draft 6 and looking for misplaced commas.
Yeah.
Good God, does that get old quick?
I would imagine so, yes.
Like, even if it's like this tiny little project, if it's something you genuinely want to read or write yourself, you're more likely to stick with it.
That
So
is,
that always just whatever.
that's good advice. And something I haven't necessarily heard other people say before, right? Like, it makes a lot of sense. Like, sometimes I get down on myself because I'm like, I didn't complete, right? And it's like, well, but was I really passionate about what I was writing? Did I want to read it? I don't know. Maybe I didn't. Maybe that's the problem. Anyway. um, we have another question. When you start with the idea of a story of yours, what's your favorite element that you like to begin with? Is it like characters, setting, something else? Does it change?
Okay, so here's the thing. I have a background as a fanfic author. So it's usually character. Because I'm going to be honest, like, part of the reason of write what you want to read, that is kind of the principle I've held on to, partially because I've been a fanfic author.
Yeah.
It's like, I write a lot of, like, fanfic. It's more niche stuff. Because it's the stuff that I would, like, scroll and then couldn't find anything. Because I want this character to do this thing. Or I want this character to be with this person. Or I want this character to go through this specific, you know, like, trope or whatever thing like that.
Yeah.
So whenever it comes to new ideas, I usually do go for character first, simply because a lot of the stuff that I wrote as a fanfic author was very character focused, because that's what I attached to and what I wanted to write about. So new ideas, it's usually the character that comes first, and then from expanding outwards, how do I make them suffer? Or if I do have scenario first, it's like, great, how do I make characters that suffer in this environment? So that's usually what's most interesting, of just like, how do people struggle with what they've got? So if it's characters, like, oh great, so like this character, they can do this, they can do this. How do I make them cry? And rarely I think of like the actual setting or plot first.
Okay.
It's usually like the character comes first, and then it's like, oh, like that's usually the thing that sticks, even like throughout different like iterations of what they're gonna go through.
Yeah.
Because usually then it expands outwards. Or if it's the setting first, then the characters come up through, okay, which kind of characters would struggle most in this?
Let me make them. Evil mastermind.
Love it.
It works. It's working for you. Keep doing it. You've got a comment on that saying, that's fascinating to me. So, that's great.
Fascinating. Look, like I said, fanfic background, you learn how to make characters suffer.
Well, and it makes sense, too, that, like, you would start with character, because it's so clear. Like, if you're doing fanfic, like, these are established characters, and you're trying to keep their tone and their honest reactions that would happen in that situation, it makes sense that that becomes very clear in your mind when that's where you kind of started writing, right? And so, yeah. And honestly, though, I think most writers at this point started with fanfiction, if we're honest.
Break the shame of that, because it's like, oh, you wrote fanfic. It's like, that's so many fan artists who then become like professional artists, or like fan artists of Batman who then work on Batman comics, and it's like, why is it the shame on fanfic?
Why do I feel bad about writing extensions to my favorite TV shows? I don't know. Yeah, it's true. That is a weird stigma. And maybe it's because so much of it's cringe, but like I would argue there's a lot of cringe artwork too. So you're not wrong. Okay, final question in our last couple of minutes. They also said they really appreciate your input on the last question. What made you want to be a writer? Like, what inspired you?
Oh, okay. So, like, I've always been in stories since I was a kid. I wrote my first short story when I was 7. It's like, it's something I've always enjoyed. Like, I was always like a huge bookworm. I devoured book after book after book. And then afterwards I realized, oh, I want to get into something literature, not necessarily knowing, oh, I want to be a writer. But then I was like, as I got older, and the more I wrote just, again, fanfic which was mostly for myself, the more I was like, you know what, I genuinely want to do this. It was kind of like, it was obvious in hindsight, it was obvious to everyone else around me. But I myself only firmly realized, oh, this is what I want to do when I was like 19 or 20.
Yeah.
but it was obvious to everyone else. But I guess the moment where I properly realized that was when I was genuinely excited about posting a new chapter of like, yes, I'm so excited of like what I've done with this, you know, where this is going. I'm excited to get to the end of it. And then I started getting like kind of my own ideas of it as well as I was doing some creative writing classes in uni as well, because I've always enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And then I realized I want to go further with it. I want to get better at it. And I don't just want to do this with characters that I already love. I want to build them with characters that, you know, I make myself.
Yeah. That is beautiful. I love that. That it was just like this slow, it was a slow burn itself, a slow burn realization of like, oh, I'm not doing this just as a hobby. It is something I am deeply passionate about and want
Yeah.
to maybe do full time.
Yeah.
That's great.
So it's Silver and Idiots in Love.
But with writing. Well, thank you so much for coming on stream today and having a conversation with us. I don't see any more questions in the comments, so I will go ahead and wrap us up because I know if about to go past my hour mark and you were on a little bit early because of technical issues anyway. So I really appreciate you coming and being here. Thank you to you and to your publisher, Bandel Books, for setting this up and being here. It was so great to talk to you, and I am just super excited to see book 2. And good luck with Nano.
Thank you so much. It was
Wow.
amazing being here. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was great.
I'm glad you had a good time. I will go ahead and end the stream now, and I will, if you're watching this later, I will put a link in the description box down below to the short story that she wrote as like a prequel, as well as her actual book. So those links will be in the description for you to pick up the Sunlit Ruins Sunlit Ruins. I can't speak. And also to pick up the Masks of the River, I believe is the short story name.
Masks on the Water.
Masks on the Water. Sorry. Bah! But yeah, I'll get those links down there and pick them up and give them a read. She's an awesome writer, and this was a really, really fun book. So cannot recommend enough.